Clare Croft is a associate professor of dance at the School of Music, Theatre and Dance at the University of Michigan. She's the author of books such as Dancers as Diplomats, American Choreography and Cultural Exchange, and the editor of Queer Dance, Meanings and Makings. In confluence with her scholarly activities, Croft is also deeply involved in the artistic practice. As a curator and a dramaturg, she is the founding curator of Explode Queer Dance Festival, a dance festival that is currently on a US national tour. And as dramaturg, she frequently collaborates with artists such as Thomas de France and Jennifer Harman. Croft was a regular dance contributor to the Washington Post from 2002 to 2005, and dance critic of the Austin American Statesman from 2005 to 2010. Currently, she writes for the Brooklyn Rail and Art Forum. In 2018, Croft founded Daring Dances, a curatorial initiative focused on how dance can lead people into necessary if difficult conversations. Croft is currently working on a book which has the title Jill Johnston, a different kind of lady, and focuses on Johnston's works as a dance critic, as a dance and arts critic, and as a lesbian activist. In her talk, Croft will explore the work of this dancer turned dance critic turned lesbian feminist activist in order to consider how the positionality of lesbianism offers a particular perspective on contemporary dance. So please join me in welcoming.
In 1965, in Buffalo, New York, Jill Johnston stood on a box. The occasion of her standing was the Buffalo Gala Festival of the Arts. Johnston had been invited by festival organizers to curate 2 programs, though she was best known at the time as a journalist, a dance writer for the relatively new, left-leaning New York alternative weekly The Village Voice. As, essentially, the Voice's dance critic, she had been among the first to chronicle the development of the Judson Dance Theater, the group of choreographers and visual artists turned choreographers now generally canonized as the founding force of postmodern dance in the U.S. So, in some ways, Judson had gotten Johnston to Buffalo, and she brought Judson with her. For one of the 2 programs she curated, Johnston drew from the Judson cadre. That mixed bill featured Robert Morris, Yvonne Rainer, and Lucinda Childs, among others. Johnston's other curatorial program featured what she called a lecture event, a hybrid form she assembled from her appearances in various happenings over the years, and her written theorizing of art and performance. As she put it, she built her lecture events, which she initially did as solos, and then later turned into group affairs, from a collage of, quote, action tableau and passages about art and other sources. In 1965, Jill's lecture events were still solos, a dare to herself and to her audience to subvert the usual flow of public art world panel discussions. Johnston loathed these panels, so frequent at the time in New York's powerful modernist museums and galleries. She saw these panels as elevating writers' and scholars' comments on art over direct experience with art, creating a hierarchy that valued, usually, the non-artist's so-called expert opinions about art, overvaluing art, particularly performance, as a democratizing, potentially disruptive event. Jill's dismissal of lauding experts was not a dismissal of spectators' experiences of art, but was rather born from her desire to understand spectators, art, and artists as deeply entangled parties. This investment and entanglement drove Johnston's writing about performance. In her weekly columns in The Voice, she worked to capture something of her encounters with performance and what those encounters afforded her as a spectator, an approach that blurred distinctions between art and audience, art and life, and between writing about art and art itself. Writing in 1964 about this desire to intertwine performance criticism and performance, Johnston, in a Village Voice column she later described as a personal favorite, wrote that basically the performance art group Fluxus had moved into the street and onto my typewriter. Johnston largely dismissed trying to make sense of what she saw, as she thought so-called experts did, and instead focused her writing on offering readers an experience, a sensation of performance, more interested in how what she saw required her to see and sense anew. This interest in blurring distinctions, having actual experiences, is some of how and why Jill came to be, how I come to be, standing on this box. Thankfully, Johnston did not stay on the box all that long. Instead, she jumped down across the stage and leapt up to catch hold of a structure sculptor Robert Morris had built for her, a hanging wooden rectangle built to support Johnston's weight, but also built to fall apart. Her performance ended when the structure gave way, leaving her amidst a pile of wood on the floor. Reflecting on the Buffalo event in her first memoir decades later, particularly the feeling of being in that pile on the floor, Johnston would say that from a symbolic point of view, the moment was perhaps interesting, but as an event, that it left something to be desired. Crafting symbols, pronouncing parts as coming together into an elevated whole, was an artistic approach Johnston vehemently and frequently criticized. She did not think such semiotic construction work sufficiently challenged or disarmed audiences. As she put it in an early 1960s review, if an audience was, quote, interested in seeing itself nakedly reflected, as she thought audiences should be, as she was, quote, symbolic forms were not enough. They were merely artful exaggeration, dilution, and idealization. All of these acts, creating symbols, valuing experts, and creating order rather than disorder, could be categorized as creating relational systems based in hierarchy, seeing one idea, item, or voice as somehow able to hover above the rest. In contrast, Johnston saw dance and what we now probably call performance art, and their attendant emphases on the physical as at their best when they were in always shifting, discordant array. Yet this wasn't just about valuing action over symbol, but was instead about how action manifests desire. Johnston preferred when actions like walking, running, spinning, climbing, falling were enactments of desire. When performing in Alan Caprell's staging of Stockhausen's Original in 1964, Johnston said she made most, maybe all, of her choices based on the fact, as she said, that she, quote, liked to climb and hang on things. When I interview of Von Rainer about what Jill was like as part of the art and social scene in downtown New York in the early 60s, Rainer remembers how often she would lose track of Jill in the course of the night, and then look up in the middle of a party to see Jill, once again, she said, clambering all over the water pipes. To be physically challenged by performance, to be dared by performance, to be turned on by performance, to see anew in performance, are some of the impulses that drove Johnston's writing over the 10 or so years she focused on dance criticism. She became a dance critic in 1955 to pursue dance writing, as she called it, a serious intellectual endeavor. This set her apart from the milieu of New York's dance powerful in the 1950s, who, instead of investing curiously in the possibility of change in the dance world, clung tight to the seemingly now plateaued earlier generations of American modern dance. A very small group of people, growing smaller by the day it seemed, determined what was seen on New York's dance stages and taught in the city studios. Rather than allow coming change to disperse power, a few held power tightly, consolidating it among an already elite group, and monumentalizing it through the institutions they ran, the publication The Dance Observer, the training ground that was Juilliard, major presenter of the 92nd Street Y, among others. Johnston contested this concentration of power. In 1957, accusing critics of being misguided in their intentions of new artistic developments. She wrote, "Looking within ourselves and finding nothing to respond with, we attribute to the artist a poverty which is our own," end quote. And she always saw institutionalization as an impediment to art. In a 1965 column that was essentially her goodbye to Judson, she said, quote, "Judson was never a stable institution, thankfully. The entire arrangement was a momentary expediency, and modern dance, at its best, remains an individual affair and not an institutional business." Louis Horst, who first hired Johnston to write about dance after she sent him a letter berating him, prized unity in choreographic form. Johnston saw the problem of prizing unity. It trains us to look for a pretense of order rather than to wrestle with difference or contradiction, and I would add, inequality. Johnston moved to New York's downtown, East Broadway community in 1960. A neighborhood Carolee Shamon characterized in our interview about Jill as one that drew artists because of, quote, "the mysteriousness of all the empty lofts, these adventurous, big, rough, crummy spaces where we could really spread out." Johnston said she immediately loved the messiness she felt around East Broadway. Reflecting on the scenes she found as neighborhood and as artistic community, Jill wrote of loving how, quote, "intimacy was not obscured by manners, and strange behavior was condoned and indulged." At the time of her move, it would still be more than a decade before Johnston became, as she was once infamously called, quote, "America's most out lesbian." In 1960, she was a single mother of 2 young children, fleeing an abusive husband, and still internally debating what her relationship to other women might be. Reflecting on her awkward attempts at voicing her nascent lesbian desire, Johnston repurposed Artaud's famous image of how an actor should approach performance, as, quote, "a victim being burned at the stake, signaling through the flames." Like many in the early 60s, Johnston was drawn to Artaud's image as one that captured the intense stakes of performance and performance's ability to display the difficulties of communication. She frequently drew on Artaud to critique the happenings that she felt by the early 1960s were becoming increasingly slick and increasingly symbolic. She thought Capra and his mostly masculine crowd were resisting doing what she called, quote, "the real thing." She dismissed them as using symbols, often women, as objects rather than examining their own male desire. Jill demanded art deal with the realities of connections and desires in all their fraught mysteries. Given this, it's probably not surprising Artaud becomes the frame through which she remembers standing on an apartment stairway, looking up at a straight woman a few steps above, trying to speak of her desire. Of her attempt made to friend and fellow dancer Sally Silver as the two carried groceries upstairs, Jill wrote later, well, at best, I believed I signaled my intentions through the flames. Ever since I learned that the person I first knew as a poetic dance writer also wrote Lesbian Nation, I have searched Jill's voluminous dance and art writing for signs of lesbianism. I don't know what I was searching for. Proto-lesbian, lesbian spectatorship, something. But I never get much further than her first review of Yvonne Rainer in 1961, where she writes, quote, Yvonne Rainer, the dancer, was nice to look at as she sat still on the chair. She continues, describing Rainer doing, quote, an exercise in excruciating slow motion of bending the knees, contracting the abdomen, and grimacing the facial muscles. Nice to look at is probably not much to the foul. It seems more like proof that female objectification knows no identity bounds, and knee-bending stomach contractions or facial grimaces have yet to turn anyone into a lesbian. Lesbianism, though, is perhaps more appropriately imagined as moments of recognition rather than conclusive confirmation. Flashes of connection for those of us who need them, not announcements for those who don't. The flash, the trace I want to follow in Jill's dance writing toward a lesbian future to come manifests in a later review of Rainer. Writing about the duet titled Bob in Rainer's Terrain, Jill says, quote, the content is really something, but it's always the transformation that makes you care. The gendered content Jill offers in various writings about her life prior to coming out doesn't pose much possibility for women. Of being a child and early adolescent, she describes vacillating quite happily between, as she calls them, successful girl and adventurous boy. As she heads to an all-girls school in 7th grade, she often understands herself as among what she calls the boys of the school, quote, very dashing girls who were fine athletes. Yet confessing her attraction to another girl, to a single girl, rather than playing in the more palatable, always shifting adoration among girls, delivers Jill her first experience of being, in her words, a failed girl. She can only remedy the situation by falling now for a real boy, a student at a nearby all-boys school, although she says what she really fell for was not that boy, but, quote, her new status as a girl. Early adulthood continues to affirm heterosexuality as a path to attaining recognition, even status, but it also confirms that status as girl, status as coming woman, carries with it being shamed, trapped, or seen as a fraud. The descriptors Johnston uses for herself during early adulthood include wife and mother, floozy, female impastor, and in female drag. The dance world made some things better and some things worse. Johnston describes being a dancer in New York in the 1950s as a paradox of sorts, studying an art form that she says has always been imagined as, quote, a girl's profession par excellence, but where, in actuality, she remembers feeling, quote, trapped between the sexes, party neither to male camaraderie or able to fulfill the idealized category of woman. But it seems that being in the audience, being an art spectator, writing about performance, offered her a way forward. A first taste of queer mutability that she had not, as of the 60s, found in her dancing or in her personal life. In 1968, writing about an audience at a mixed-rep performance in Central Park, Johnston wrote one of the most epic visions of gender and sexual transformation as an exquisite slip and slide of pleasure and possibility. A queen is a queen, is a boy, is a girl, is a ballerina, is a boy, is a dyke, is a fag, is a butch, is a boy, is a girl, is just a kinky son of a gun like the rest of us. Hello, all you sexes, we're too good to be true. The content is really something, but it's always the transformation that makes you care. Jill was getting excited about what she called the new dance years before she saw the first Judson concert in the summer of 1962. Among those she had been watching were, of course, Rainer, but also Fred Herko, a figure not always remembered as central to downtown dance, although more recently he's been rediscovered. Johnston would eventually sum up her love of Herko as choreographer and performer by lauding his ability to bring together, quote, a strange logic of parts that have no business being together, but which go together anyway, because anything in life can go with anything else if you know what you're doing. Johnston's only ever recorded complaint with Herko's choreographic choices came in 1963 when, writing about his Binghamton Birdie, she noted, quote, Mr. Herko danced around on one roller skate, but I don't think he did it soon enough. Binghamton Birdie also held a moment of critique of consolidation and monumentalization I suspect Johnston also liked. In the piece, Herko wore a superhero t-shirt with a made-up insignia that spelled out Judson, a costuming choice that seems prescient now amidst the seemingly never-ending canonization of Judson. In Herko, Johnston found, as she had earlier lauded an older choreographer and Judson's predecessor, James Waring's performances, quote, disjointed nonsense and the most unlikely but somehow plausible mess of buffoonery, end quote. This is no small artistic feat, coupling illogical logics and humor, but the fact of who Johnston sees as capable of this complex duality begs the question of who gets allowed to experiment in public with not making sense, and who can do so without paying too great a cost. So often men, almost always white people. In the 1963 Andy Warhol film, Jill and Freddie, Johnston puts her female body into this mix, defining who gets to be strange and campy and quasi-public. She creates, with Herko, intriguing nonsense. Much has been written in the last decade or so about Herko in this film, generally in the context of Warhol's love of filming Herko, a love that likely began when Warhol saw Herko perform Binghamton Birdie. I'm always somewhat shocked by how much the writing about Jill and Freddie the film overlooks Johnston's presence. Reading the many essays and transcripts of discussions about the film, one could actually believe Jill is only in the title, not the film, or at most plays an incidental role. How do people continue to miss the nearly 6-foot-tall white lesbian standing center stage? But Jill would tell me probably to resist the experts. In Warhol's film, though, Herko is undeniably gorgeous, at once perfecting and exceeding balletic line. Jill seems slightly drunk, maybe on the beer she puts down in order to dance, maybe on the memory of Isadora Duncan suggested by her quasi-tunic. She conducts an unseen orchestra and/or preenings for a crowd of admirers as her tombe pas parades around the chair, the throne on which she stands. Her hips swish, her elbows drip. Off the chair, she staggers and sways. Her torso swings above stuttering feet. To Herko's laser-like diagonal progress, she offers a jerky hip thrust, a small joke, not seduction. As opposed to Jill's off-kilter, determinedly female swish, Herko's performance is quite legible. If there can be such a thing as textbook camp, that is what he offers. Herko's ballet could be what danced through Susan Sontag's mind a year later when she wrote, quote, "Camp involves a new, more complex relation to the serious. One can be serious about the frivolous and frivolous about the serious." Herko's excellent and excessive, almost nude plus sneakers ballet is pretty much just that. One could argue, too, that Jill's swish also offers a camp performance. She suggests men hold no special purchase on the sensibility du jour of camp. This would be a particularly salient way to think about Jill a couple of years later, as she transformed from downtown writer into gender-bending celebrity on the avant-garde art party scene, sometimes flown in her vintage velvet top hat and tails to out-of-town parties with Warhol, camp on delivery. But I think what's most remarkable in the film is not exactly how the two take on a camp sensibility differently, singularly. It is their co-presence that demands more attention. They are both quite present simultaneously. No one could mistake this for a hetero coupling, yet they still read as man and woman. Their dance together and apart recalls Jill's writing about her love of Dada, an aesthetic she once summed up as asking the important question, why shouldn't this go with that and be called something else? Dancing together, Jill and Freddie offer the kind of queer camp Ella Ann Pellegrini dreams of in her theorizing. Defiantly melancholic, quote, defiantly melancholic in their imagination of different social worlds, an outsized political hope of queer sexual freedom. A man and a woman dancing playfully together, separately, not alone, not towards one another, not coupled, two queers, many genders, on a rooftop. Why shouldn't this go with that and be called something else? When I interview Carolee Schneemann about Jill, we sit on Carolee's front porch in the Hudson Valley, her cat nearby. I talk about my struggle with writing about Jill. I am unsure whether this is scholarship, a love letter, or a training manual. Carolee leans over from her chair and in a stage whisper asks me, "Is she haunting you?" I don't immediately answer. "She's probably haunting you," Carolee tells me. Sometimes I want Jill to haunt me, to infect me with her singular appetite for provocation and precise yet excessive language. Ingrid, Jill's partner for the last 30 years of her life, has asked me, wisely, whether I'm trying to write like Jill or use Jill to find my own way. But studying Jill, especially the Jill who captured the depth and complexity of performance, is also to hear her warning of valorizing ghosts. In 1960, she berated the dance establishment for missing all that was unfolding in that present moment because they were too busy, quote, looking in vain for one or another of these ghosts to rise up in flames of new glory. Jill always advocated for addressing what she called present necessity. Today's present necessity does, I think, demand there be a way to figure out how to stand on the shoulders of a woman who hung from the rafters, to learn the lessons Jill offered about how seeing, as performance offers us the chance to do, lets us practice new ways of seeing disjunction, seeing disorder, sensing difference. I consider myself, quote, I consider myself fortunate to be a spectator, to have experiences which ask no more of the observer than a desire to see. It is not easy to see. Outside the theater, living as we do, most of us see very little with our eyes wide open. In action, the eye absorbs space forms to function. In response, the eye becomes a facial decoration as sight turns inward. And our training is such that when we do look for non-functional reasons, it is usually at something huge and spectacular, like cathedrals or sunsets. And even then, it is rare to see more than a general outline, to see more and still enter. That is the crucial transition from seeing to entering. Not only crucial, but mysterious. Jill Johnston, 1961.